Let's begin by reading. There are a couple of comments left over from verses 5 through 11. So why don't we begin reading there and then continue through verse 17. So chapter 12, verse 5. And have you forgotten the exhortation which addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor lose courage when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines him whom he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time at their pleasure, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Later, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with all men, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fail to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by it the many become defiled. That no one be immoral or irreligious like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. So going back to verse 5, and have you forgotten the exhortation? There's an implicit rebuke there that they, in fact, have forgotten, that they don't understand. So he's basically, this is drawn from Proverbs, and he's basically trying to outline the meaning of biblical discipline. And the implication is that they've forgotten it, completely. And so he ends this section with, therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, which implies that their hands are drooping, that their knees are weak, and that there aren't straight paths for their feet. He also says that what son is there whom his father does not discipline? So who has the father most spectacularly disciplined?
Jesus.
His own son, Jesus. Yeah.
Right. So underlying that whole argument is the notion that if God disciplines his son, then we can't expect anything very much different. And so, clearly here he's talking about uh, suffering up to the point of persecution and martyrdom. So God disciplines so that we may share his holiness, he says. We don't generally view discipline as or punishment as very good. But in Romans chapter 8, Paul says, we know that all things work for good for those who love God. So, how does discipline get worked and punishment and martyrdom get worked for good? What's good about it?
Well, discipline doesn't have to mean, really strong discipline. Gentle discipline even does. Just a straightening of the way, for instance, of a child. Just reminding a child or setting a boundary for the child so that they are on the straight and, the straight path always works. Because if you let them loose and they go and nothing ever happens, they won't know that there are any guardrails.
Mm-hmm. But in what way? So, in what way
With
is
love. You can discipline with love.
yeah? I mean, that's true. Although, what does he mean by discipline?
Teaching.
Like training, like guiding,
Yeah.
like steering you to the right path, I guess, right? It's like,
What is the right path?
well, I mean, to do God's will. So, if you get off,
Okay.
right? So if you do something that's displeases God, then you get corrected to go in the right direction. It's like that's what I think of discipline's meant to direct somebody, right? It's more of a steering mechanism than it is a punitive. It's less. It's not a punishment, although it may feel like it, right? Disciplining is to instruct you on how to do things properly, right? So
So I think he has a rather broader view. So martyrdom, persecution becomes a form of discipline. And the implication is that God allows suffering for his own purpose, which we can't understand.
Mhm.
And so, therefore, that suffering, that persecution, martyrdom
but
becomes part of the divine will.
I think if you are trying to discipline an individual, you cannot martyr them, because if you're trying to discipline them, if you martyr them, they're gone, right? So maybe in martyr would be an example to discipline somebody, right? But doesn't seem like martyrdom would be a a method of discipline.
Well, the problem, I mean, the underlying issue here, which he is really kind of underlying his argument, is sort of the problem of it's called theodicy, is the theological term, which is the question of why does God allow suffering? Why, you know, when Jesus clearly healed everybody and Jesus is the face of God, and therefore God's desire is that nobody be sick, nobody have cancer, whatever. Why are people sick and why do people have cancer? God's desire is certainly not that his church be persecuted, yet the church is persecuted and people are martyred. And God
Like
certainly would, it's
I thought,
highly undesirable to send one's own son to the cross, and yet Christ came into the world to die on the cross. So, so the underlying question here that he's raising is that that we have to look beyond immediate circumstance and recognizing that part of that punishment is dealt out not by God directly, but by sinners and by people who are hostile and people who are opposed. And then the question becomes, how does it fit into God's ultimate plan? How does it impact the kingdom of God? And so, and the cross is an outstanding example that the greatest evil is transformed into the greatest good. The death of martyrs profoundly touched their persecutors in many cases and led to conversion experiences for them. So the death of the martyrs is extremely important as one of the ways in which Christianity grew. It's also, and then of course the martyrs themselves receive a eternal reward. So there is suffering, but it's followed by glory. The in the opinion of the world, that may not be very good because you're dead, but life ultimately can't be extinguished. And so that's the kind of thing we sort of suffer, but we have confidence in the belief that God will turn suffering into good if we are recognized as discipline by the Lord for our improvement, for the improvement of humankind, for the growth of the kingdom, for the achievement of God's purpose. That we see ourselves as servants. So does that make sense?
Mhm.
I think part of it is just, we're in this world and we have free will, as does everybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's almost like it's a culmination of free will and human nature. And
Yeah,
God doesn't, construct everything, right? If he did, we wouldn't have free will, right?
right, right, right. God constructs very little ultimately. I mean, clearly God has constructed the world around us and he's constructed us, but exactly what we do and the evil we do to one another, which is part of the suffering that the author is talking about, is not God's direct doing. God knows of it, and in the end, God transforms it. And that's what Paul means when he says God works all things for good. We then have that exhortation, which in verses 12 and 13, which is taken from chapter 4, verses 26 and 7 of Proverbs. Proverbs says, keep straight the path of your feet, and all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. In Proverbs, that directive is really ethical. It's part of the, sort of the acquisition of wisdom, or how one acquires wisdom. Here, the implication is one of spiritual paralysis and of a troubled relationship with God. And then he concludes with, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. What he's talking about there is that in some form, the dependence of members of the community on one another or on the community as a whole, because lifting drooping hands, strengthening weak knees, making straight paths for your feet doesn't affect what is lame being put out of joint. The implication is that if you do these things, those who are lame may not be put out of joint. So it's that the behavior of one member of the community, the attitude of one, the relationship of one member of the community can affect and improve and remove the lameness of other members of the community.
I did have a question. There was a footnote in my Bible that says, under that very verses 12 and 13, that Christians should regard their own suffering as the affectionate correction of the Lord. And that threw me off. So it's like saying God has love for us to suffer or something, you know. It didn't like he was correcting us through affection to suffer. Am I reading it wrong? I didn't quite understand that footnote.
I mean, there's an element of, there's an element of mystery to suffering. So does God cause us to suffer? No, he doesn't.
Oh, I think I got it. That the affection comes through the suffering. That at the end we'll be with the Lord in life ever after.
Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of make it?
Yeah, that
Kind of sounds. It makes sense to me now. Oh, thank you.
Also,
for the help.
Also, I mean, going back to Saint Cyprian and his work on the pandemic, as everybody in the world suffers, as Christians, we should expect to suffer more.
Yeah.
And the important thing about suffering isn't the suffering itself, is how one bears one's suffering. Does one bear it with dignity? Or does one bear it with malice and hatred and cursing of God and cursing of one's neighbor? And the measure of a Christian, in Saint Cyprian's opinion, is doing the former, bearing it with dignity, bearing it despite suffering with love of God and love of neighbor. Um, and in some ways, also, I mean, for Cyprian, and for many of the early Christians, exposing yourself to suffering knowingly. So during pandemics, Christians were notable for the fact that whereas everyone else was fleeing and trying to avoid, the plague or pandemics, Christians were the people who stayed to care for the dying and frequently became infected and themselves died. But they cared for the dying, including people they didn't know, just anyone dying, with dignity, because life is important and death is important. And we have respect for the dead and respect for those who are dying. And we want to be a source of comfort to them. And for many of the early Christians in pandemics, that meant that they sacrificed their lives, but they did it joyfully, they did it knowingly, and they did it deliberately. So you can kind of look at that as the suffering, the correction from God, but it's not God that really inflicts it.
Mm-hmm.
It's circumstance. It's the question is, how do you want to respond in the midst of suffering in this case? And one of the ways is that you suffer yourself. And so we begin here with strive for peace with all men and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. How does this whole section relate to the previous section? For many people argue that it's just kind of a non sequitur, unrelated.
Well, the section just above it is talking about the community as a whole, and so is this one. It's not talking about the individual, but it's talking about working together as a community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
again, it's keeping this path straight. No bitter roots spring up and cause trouble, to which many become defiled. That's just about what that last one was about, just in a different way.
Uh-huh, yeah. Yeah, there, yeah. Lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, etc. And
Mm-hmm.
so this section becomes sort of a description of what has to be done or considered to do that.
Yeah.
What must be done to strengthen the weakest members of his audience.
That you're not, your life isn't just for yourself, it's for your community, and working towards making sure everybody reaches the goal, not just you. Because if it's just you, you won't make it. You can't do it on your own.
Mm-hmm. In verse 10, it says, "For they disciplined us for a short time at their pleasure, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness." And then in verse 14, he says, "Strive for peace with all men and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord." So they're linked by the striving for holiness. And so he says to strive for or to pursue peace and to pursue holiness. What does it mean to pursue peace or to pursue holiness? I mean, can we choose to pursue? Can we choose to receive peace and to receive holiness?
I think we can.
To be peaceful in our relationships, yes. You can choose to be contrary or you can choose to be peaceful. Think about that.
Well, would the author say that we can freely choose?
Well, it's not an absence of conflict. It's just how you view it and how you move through it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought God bestowed us with holiness, and it's up to us to maintain it or give it up. Like Esau.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think the author is, in some sense, I think you could say he believes in objectivity and not in subjectivity.
Wow.
So holiness is a fundamental attribute of God.
Mhm.
We cannot be holy in and of ourselves. There's nothing that we can do to make ourselves holy because we're separated from God. We can only be holy through the sacrifice of Christ.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Similarly, peace. I mean, we can be calm about things, we can be genial, we can be, good natured, but peace is a very different thing. Peace comes from God. Remember, so in John's gospel, when the disciples are, in the upper room and it's locked and they're scared and they're terrified that they're going to be persecuted by the Jewish religious establishment. And Jesus comes in and says, "Peace I give you." Peace is a certainty that God is in control, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it in the midst of all circumstances. Peace is the certainty that God's will in some form be done. And because I trust in God, I'll accept that. Peace is a knowledge that God is all powerful. And so we can't produce peace either. The only thing we really can do is say yes to both holiness and to peace by accepting the saving work of Christ. So I think that's what the author would say. And so peace is very real. It's just not subjective, and it's not something we can produce of our own accord. Holiness is very real. It's subjective. But it's not something that we can produce by our own accord. We can't, say, I'm going to be holy today.
We're told to live in peace with all, not just part of our community, even those who disagree with us,
Mm-hmm.
which is the challenge of the next several years here.
Yeah. Yes.
Hope that it's reciprocated.
This is true. Yeah.
And if it's not, we still have to pursue and persevere.
Knowing that God is ultimately in control, I guess.
Yeah.
And speaking of peace, Pope St. Gregory the Great said, therefore act in such a way that you garner your reward even from those who through strife might have caused it to perish.
Mm-hmm.
He's speaking of peace.
Yeah.
So why pursue peace? The language seek, pursue means very deliberate pursuit. And yet at the same time, it's not something we can manufacture. So it really means to recognize the availability of peace, recognize that peace comes through Christ, recognize that holiness comes through Christ, that it's through Christ that we can be made holy. And to focus on that and remember that Christ is the focus, Christ is the author and finisher, the perfecter of our faith. And remember, perfecter is significant because for him, perfection is the ability to stand before God. It's roughly equivalent to holiness. So it's Christ who perfects us, not we who perfect ourselves. So why peace? I mean, what's so big about peace?
I don't know, it sort of balances with he talks about bitterness, right? And so striving, to God to contribute, I guess, positively in encouraging, I guess, and for people to be peaceful,
Mm-hmm. Why should we do that?
I mean, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, that'd be contrary to what God's, hope is,
Well, why is it contrary to God's hope?
well, he's love, right? So peace and love. I mean, what would be the opposite of striving for peace? Discord. How could you want to why would you want to strive for discord?
Well, I was thinking if we're striving for peace and we don't strive it for all, those that we fail to convince for peace would stir up trouble for other people, and then we'll have more fights on our hands than keeping all at peace. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You want to exemplify God's will for peace,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and so we will strive for it. But if we don't pursue that,
Mm-hmm.
then those people that we don't reach will just cause other people to turn away from peace.
Uh-huh.
And that will cause more trouble for all of us.
Yeah.
So we have to keep fighting for everyone,
Yeah.
to maintain peace.
Otherwise, we're not spreading peace.
keep
For
spreading.
spreading the discontent or the,
Yeah, not
whatever.
allowing it to spread.
yeah.
So Colin, you said God's will for peace.
Well, I'm just saying God's love,
And
right? I mean, the
no, no,
ultimate,
no, I think, I think that's important, God's will for peace. Even more than that, later in chapter 13, in verse 20, he says, now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, etc. So God of peace. Or remember in the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers. So we have, Beatitudes, mourn, poor in spirit, um, persecuted, etc. What are all of those things? What are the Beatitudes?
they're the right attitudes. They're
Does anyone remember from Matthew, which was a long time ago now? What are all of those things? I mean, why does Jesus pronounce them blessed?
They're the ones that are suffering for God's sake because they're keeping focused on God, and they'll
I mean,
suffer.
that may be the
It-
result, but
Okay.
that's not, how come they're considered blessed? I mean, what are they?
Because they're focused. They're on that they're on that straight path.
they're the behaviors that exemplify, God's will. I mean, what you should do, how you should
Move
perceive or to.
move a little bit beyond God's will.
Well, their
Each
actions
of,
on our part.
but
I
more,
mean, it's how you get to. I mean, I guess it's how you get to peace. It's how you get to heaven. It's how you get to love. It's
What pleases
well,
God.
the important thing about them is that they're all attributes of God.
Mhm.
So St. Gregory of Nyssa says there is really only one attribute, only one beatitude. That beatitude is God. The single beatitude is God.
And God is love.
All of the other things, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, those are all attributes of God.
Mhm.
And so when we
Mhm.
share in those attributes, we are imitating Christ in the world.
Mhm.
That's why those are beatitudes. That's why we're blessed when we take on those attributes, when we are meek, when we mourn, when we are poor in spirit, when we are peacemakers. So those are all attributes of God, and that's sort of extremely important. Here again, that this isn't subjective. This is very objective. And peace also ties back to Proverbs chapter 4, verse 27. From the Septuagint, chapter 4, verse 27 says, decline not to the right hand nor to the left. Turn away your foot from evil. For the Lord knows the ways that are on the right hand, but those are perverse which are on the left hand. But he will make your course straight. He will bring forward your ways in peace. So, peace. And so, peace is also should be an attribute of the community, which is sort of a reflection of the solidarity of the community and the responsibility of members of the community for one another. What about holiness?
Well, it says if you don't have holiness with no one will see the Lord. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord.
Right. Because God is holy. Those who are able to be in God's presence must be holy. So holiness isn't subjective either. We tend to see holiness as very individual terms. And in part individuals can or cannot be holy. But the author also sees it as a social attribute or an attribute of community.
Well, the way I was gonna say, I sort of see all these things as sort of saying, hey, you need to maintain a straight path and be a good example to others so that God sees, or others see God in what you do, right?
Mhm.
That sort of, in my mind, sums up what's sort of happening here.
But the you that he's addressing is both, you as individuals and the community as a whole.
Hmm. Well, as Christians, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't want anybody to be deprived of God's grace.
No, no, no. Then follow the injunction. See to it that no one fail to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness spring up and cause trouble, and by it the many become defiled. That no one be immoral or irreligious like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. The language is based very much on um, chapter 29 of Deuteronomy in the Septuagint. And so this kind of is a hint of what he's pointing to. The language comes from chapter 29 of Deuteronomy. And if everyone remembers, chapter 28 of Deuteronomy is everyone's favorite chapter of Deuteronomy.
Oh,
It has the curses.
oh,
And so chapter 29 is kind of a continuation of that. So although he's not talking about this explicitly, what he's really talking about here is covenant. And then we'll see that very clearly when we get to Esau. Esau fundamentally turned his back on and trivialized the covenant. So the description of him as immoral is really that he was an idolater. He rejected God and God's grace and God's gifts in favor of some lentil stew. Not that lentil stew it's not good, of course, because it is. Lentil is just really great, but priorities